In the dead of night, on November 13, 1942, the sea south of the Solomon Islands became a vision of hell. The waters, soon to be christened Iron Bottom Sound for the dozens of warships that would find their graves there, churned with chaos. Two fleets, stumbling upon each other in the suffocating darkness, had transformed the tranquil channel into a floating slaughterhouse. This was not a battle of elegant maneuvers or strategic genius. It was a point-blank, merciless brawl. On the bridge of the American cruiser, USS San Francisco, Admiral Daniel Callahan was desperately trying to make sense of the maelstrom. Radar screens were a blizzard of phantom contacts. Signal lamps flashed indecipherable messages. Then, out of the blackness, the colossal silhouette of the Japanese battleship Hiei appeared, its guns blazing. The two flagships were so close that the American sailors could see the faces of their enemies illuminated by the muzzle flashes. Shells tore through the San Francisco's unarmored superstructure, turning steel into shrapnel and men into memories. Admiral Callahan and most of his staff were killed in an instant. Just miles away, another American cruiser, the USS Juno, was caught in the same vortex of fire. A Japanese torpedo struck her, crippling the ship and forcing her to withdraw as dawn broke. Battered but afloat, she limped away from the battlefield, her crew believing the worst was over. Aboard were 5 brothers from Waterloo, Iowa. George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert Sullivan had insisted on serving together, a request granted by a Navy that could never have foreseen this moment. As the small group of surviving American ships steered south, a lone torpedo from the Japanese submarine I-26 found the wounded Juno. The warship vaporized in a single, cataclysmic explosion. Of the nearly 700 men aboard, only 10 would ultimately survive the blast and the agonizing days adrift that followed. All 5 Sullivan brothers were lost. This single, brutal moment, the loss of a family, the annihilation of a ship, was a microcosm of the 6-month campaign for a place most Americans had never heard of, a fever-ridden, jungle-choked island named Guadalcanal. The battle for this island was not merely another engagement in a long and bloody war. It was something more. It was the crucible. The story we are often told about the Pacific War has a simple, clean turning point: the Battle of Midway. In June of 1942, the United States Navy, against all odds, sank 4 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers, crippling the Imperial Japanese Navy's offensive power in a single decisive stroke. Midway, the legend goes, was the high-water mark of the Japanese Empire, the moment the tide of war irrevocably turned. And while that victory was undeniably spectacular, it is a dangerous oversimplification. It is a myth. Midway was a staggering blow, but it was a battle fought at a distance, a clash of admirals and aviators over hundreds of miles of open ocean. It stopped the bleeding, but it did not kill the beast. The Japanese Empire still stretched from the borders of India to the Central Pacific. Its army, one of an elite and battle-hardened force, remained virtually untouched. Its powerful surface fleet of battleships and cruisers was still a formidable threat, and its leadership, infected with a national arrogance born of decades of victory, believed their ultimate triumph was still inevitable. They believed they could absorb a single defeat and continue their expansion. This documentary will argue that the true, grinding, and irreversible turning point of the Pacific War was not the clean, swift victory at Midway, but the ugly, protracted, and attritional nightmare of Guadalcanal. This was not a battle of grand strategy, but a desperate struggle for a muddy airfield. It was here, in the malarial swamps, on the blood-soaked ridges, and in the shark-infested waters, that the momentum of the entire war was fundamentally broken and reset. Guadalcanal was a meat grinder, a black hole that began to systematically devour the foundations of Japanese military power. It consumed Japan's irreplaceable veteran pilots, its elite soldiers, and its dwindling supply of ships and material. It was a campaign of brutal arithmetic, a test not of tactical brilliance, but of industrial might, logistical endurance, and national will. Midway may have been the moment Japan lost the initiative, but Guadalcanal was the place it lost the war. It was the first domino in a chain reaction of collapse, a campaign that exposed the fatal flaw in Japan's war machine and set the United States on the long, bloody road to Tokyo. This is the story of how a forgotten island became the graveyard of an empire's ambitions. To understand why Guadalcanal became the war's true fulcrum, we must first dispel the myth of American ascendancy in the summer of 1942. The victory at Midway had created a dangerous illusion of security. In Washington, D.C., and the strategic priority was clear and unwavering: Europe first. The primary enemy was Nazi Germany. The Pacific was, in many respects, a secondary theater, a holding action to be managed with limited resources until Hitler was defeated. The American public, reeling from Pearl Harbor but buoyed by Midway, saw a clear path forward. But the men tasked with fighting the war in the Pacific saw a far more precarious reality. The American war machine was still spooling up. Its industrial capacity was immense, but it was not yet fully mobilized. The Navy, though victorious at Midway, was stretched perilously thin across two oceans. In the Pacific, it could count its operational aircraft carriers on one hand. This scarcity of force created a paralyzing strategic debate, a fierce and often bitter rivalry between the two titans of the American Pacific Command, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Ernest King. MacArthur, commanding the Southwest Pacific area from Australia, was the embodiment of the U.S. Army. Charismatic, imperious, and possessing an almost messianic belief in his own destiny, he saw the path to victory as an army-led crusade, hopping from island toss to island, fulfilling his famous promise, "I shall return." He envisioned a grand offensive to retake the Philippines, with the Navy playing a supporting, almost subordinate role. In Washington, Admiral King, the Chief of Naval Operations, held a starkly different view. King was gruff, demanding, and utterly convinced that the Pacific was a naval war. He saw MacArthur's plans as slow, ponderous, and ignorant of the realities of sea power. He believed the Navy, with its carrier task forces and amphibious Marine Corps, should lead the charge directly across the Central Pacific, striking at the heart of the Japanese defense. This wasn't just a disagreement over strategy. It was a fundamental battle for control over the entire war effort, a contest of institutional pride between the Army and the Navy. While they argued, the Japanese were not idle. The Japanese High Command, though shocked by the losses at Midway, was far from defeated. Their empire was a fortress. From the resource-rich Dutch East Indies to the vital stronghold of Rabaul on the island of New Britain, their defensive perimeter seemed impregnable. Rabaul was the linchpin, a massive air and naval base from which Japan could project power south, threatening the vital sea lanes between the United States and Australia. To secure this southern flank, they planned to establish a chain of interlocking air bases, creating an unsinkable aircraft carrier that would make any Allied advance impossible. Their gaze fell upon the Solomon Islands, a remote archipelago of volcanic peaks and dense rainforest. And within that chain, they identified a particular island, a large, undeveloped landmass with a flat coastal plain perfect for an airfield, Guadalcanal. To the Japanese, it was just another strategic outpost. To the native Melanesian inhabitants, it was home. To the handful of Australian coast watchers hiding in the hills, it was a worrying development. To the world, it was nothing, a name on a map, if it was even that. In early July 1942, Japanese transport ships arrived, disgorging construction units and equipment. The men, primarily Korean laborers under Japanese command, began the arduous task of carving a runway out of the coconut groves and kunai grass near the Lunga River. They worked under the debilitating tropical sun, their progress tracked by the furtive eyes of the coast watchers, whose cryptic radio messages began to filter back to Allied intelligence. The news of an airfield being built on Guadalcanal landed like a thunderclap in the Allied command centers. An operational Japanese bomber base on that island would be a dagger pointed at the throat of the supply line to Australia. It could sever the Allied presence in the South Pacific. The strategic debate between MacArthur and King was instantly rendered moot. Action was required, and it was required now. The island of Guadalcanal, previously in obscurity, had suddenly become the most important piece of real estate on the planet. What followed was not a meticulously planned operation, but a frantic, cobbled-together response. Codenamed Operation Watchtower, it was a gamble born of necessity. The nearest available ground troops were the 1st Marine Division, under the command of Major General Alexander Vandegrift. They were in New Zealand, preparing for combat but not yet fully equipped or trained for a major amphibious assault. They were training for a marathon, and they were about to be thrown into a sprint. The plan was a compromise, a hastily brokered peace in the war between the Army and Navy. The Navy would transport and land the Marines. Once ashore, the Marines would seize the airfield. Air power from a carrier task force, commanded by the cautious and carrier-obsessed Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, would provide cover. But Fletcher, haunted by the loss of the carriers Lexington and Yorktown in previous battles, made one thing chillingly clear. His precious carriers would remain in the danger zone for no more than 72 hours. He would drop off the Marines and their initial supplies, and then he would be gone. The stakes were immense. This would be the first major American amphibious offensive of the Second World War. A generation of young men, raised in peacetime America, were about to be tested against the hardened veterans of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. The myth, born at Midway, was that the momentum was with the Allies. The reality was that they were launching a desperate, under-resourced gamble into the heart of enemy territory with no guarantee of support and no clear plan for what came next. The antagonist was not just the Japanese military, but the island itself, its suffocating jungle, its debilitating diseases, its unforgiving terrain. And above all, the antagonist was time. Everything depended on seizing that airfield before it could become an operational fortress. The first domino was about to be pushed. On the pre-dawn hours of August 7, 1942, a massive Allied fleet materialized out of the tropical squalls, appearing like a ghost city off the coast of Guadalcanal. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. For the young Marines crowded on the decks of the transport ships, it was a moment of profound, terrifying awe. The naval guns of the screening cruisers and destroyers erupted in a deafening chorus, hurling thousands of shells onto the beaches and into the jungle beyond. The roar was apocalyptic, a sound that shook the very air and seemed to tear the sky apart. The landings themselves were at first an anticlimax. As the Higgins boats churned towards the shore, the Marines braced for a storm of machine gun fire, for the slaughter they had been told to expect on the beaches. Instead, they were met with silence. The Japanese construction troops, unequipped and untrained for a major battle, had been terrified by the sheer scale of the naval bombardment. They had abandoned their posts, their half-eaten meals, their tools, and fled into the jungle, melting away into the green abyss. General Vandegrift's men walked ashore unopposed. By the following afternoon, they had captured their primary objective, the nearly completed Japanese airfield. They promptly renamed it Henderson Field, in honor of a Marine aviator killed at Midway. On the nearby islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, the story was starkly different. There, the elite Japanese Special Naval Landing Force troops fought with a fanatical ferocity that stunned the Marine raiders. It was a brutal, close-quarters fight in caves and dugouts, a grim foreshadowing of the island battles to come. But after 3 days of bloody combat, those smaller islands were also secured. On the surface, Operation Watchtower seemed a resounding success. The myth of an easy path forward seemed, for a fleeting moment, to be true. The first domino had fallen exactly as planned. But the Japanese Empire was not an opponent that stood idle after being struck. In Rabaul, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the newly formed Eighth Fleet, received the shocking news of the American invasion. He did not panic. He did not wait for orders from Tokyo. Mikawa was a bold and decisive commander, a specialist in the deadly art of night combat. He immediately gathered every available warship, 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a single destroyer, and steamed south at full speed. He was sailing directly into the teeth of a superior Allied naval force, gambling everything on a single, audacious night attack. Meanwhile, aboard the American carrier flagship, Admiral Fletcher was growing nervous. Japanese bombers from Rabaul had begun to attack his fleet, and while the damage was minimal, it confirmed his deepest fears. His carriers were vulnerable. On the evening of August 8th, true to his word, he gave the order. The American Carrier Task Force, the only source of air cover for the entire operation, turned southeast and withdrew from the battle area. The sky above Guadalcanal, which had been filled with American planes, fell silent. The withdrawal of the carriers created a cascading crisis. Without air cover, the vulnerable transport ships, still frantically trying to unload supplies for the Marines, were sitting ducks. Their commander, Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner, realized he had no choice. He would have to pull his ships out as well. The Marines ashore had received only a fraction of their food, ammunition, and heavy equipment. They were left with what they could carry and little else. They were, in effect, stranded. That night, as the Marines dug in around their new perimeter, a sense of profound isolation began to set in. They were alone, 11,000 of them, on a hostile island, deep in enemy territory. And in the darkness, Admiral Mikawa's striking force was closing in. The Allied Naval Screen, a collection of American and Australian cruisers and destroyers, patrolled the waters around Savo Island, guarding the entrances to the Sound. Their crews were exhausted after 2 days of constant alerts. Their commanders were overconfident. Their primitive radar was unreliable. They believed the night belonged to them. This belief was the fatal catalyst for one of the worst defeats in the history of the United States Navy. Shortly after 1:30 a.m. on August 9th, Mikawa's cruisers slipped past the picket destroyers undetected. They were a line of silent predators in the dark. Japanese lookouts, honed by years of intense night training, spotted the silhouettes of the Southern Allied force long before the Allies knew they were there. Mikawa gave the order. Every ship attack. What followed was a masterpiece of naval warfare on one side and a catastrophic failure on the other. Japanese float planes dropped brilliant flares, silhouetting the Allied ships against the night sky. Long lance torpedoes, the most advanced naval weapons of their time, hissed silently through the water. Mikawa's cruisers opened fire with terrifying speed and accuracy. The Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra was hit by more than 20 shells in the first few minutes and was left a burning, powerless wreck. The USS Chicago had its bow blown off by a torpedo. Mikawa then wheeled his column north to attack the second group of Allied ships. The cruisers USS Astoria, USS Quincy, and USS Vincennes were caught completely asleep. Their guns were trained in. Their crews were not at battle stations. In a chaotic, one-sided melee that lasted less than 30 minutes, all 3 American heavy cruisers were pounded into flaming hulks. They would all sink by morning, taking over 1,000 sailors with them. Mikawa's force, having annihilated the Allied screen, suffered only minor damage. He had the American transports, defenseless and loaded with supplies, at his mercy. But fearing a carrier strike at dawn, unaware that Fletcher's carriers were already hundreds of miles away, he made the prudent decision to withdraw. The Battle of Savo Island was the turning point within the turning point. It was the moment the Guadalcanal campaign transformed from a swift, amphibious seizure into a desperate 6-month siege. The myth of an easy victory, of American naval superiority, was shattered and sent to the bottom of the sea along with 4 Allied cruisers. For the Marines on Guadalcanal, the news was devastating. They were now truly alone. They had their airfield, but they were cut off, undersupplied, and surrounded. The Japanese, stung by the initial landing, were now galvanized by a stunning naval victory. They would be back. The easy part was over. The real battle for Guadalcanal had just begun. The morning after Savo Island revealed a grim new reality for the Marines on Guadalcanal. The sea was empty. The transports were gone. Their lifeline was cut. General Vandegrift's men were no longer an expeditionary force. They were a besieged garrison. They had seized Henderson Field, but now they had to hold it against an empire bent on revenge. This was the autopsy of the initial plan, and the diagnosis was dire. The campaign was on the verge of collapse. The truth that replaced the myth of a quick victory was one of desperate survival. The Japanese High Command, buoyed by Mikawa's victory, made a critical and ultimately fatal miscalculation. Infected by the victory disease, a pervasive belief in their own martial and spiritual superiority, they fundamentally underestimated their enemy. They believed the American Marines were soft, that they would crumble under pressure. They assumed the force on Guadalcanal was a small reconnaissance party, not an entire division. And so they responded not with overwhelming force, but with a piecemeal counterattack. The first to arrive was the Ichiki Detachment, an elite unit of the Imperial Japanese Army commanded by the fiery and reckless Colonel Kianao Ichiki. These were veteran soldiers, the best of the best, who had been earmarked for the invasion of Midway. Convinced he was facing only a few thousand demoralized Americans, Ichiki landed his 900-man force east of the Marine perimeter and, with almost no reconnaissance, ordered a direct frontal assault on the night of August 21st across a sandbar at the mouth of Alligator Creek. The result was not a battle. It was a massacre. The Marines, dug in behind barbed wire with machine guns and artillery, were waiting. Ichiki's men charged forward in wave after wave, their banzai cries swallowed by the thunder of American firepower. By dawn, the creek was choked with the dead. Marine tanks then crossed the river, encircling the few survivors and annihilating them. Colonel Ichiki, in disgrace, burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. The Battle of the Tenaru, as it became known, was a brutal lesson for both sides. For the Marines, it was a massive morale boost, proof that the Japanese soldier was not invincible. For the Japanese, it was a shocking wake-up call. They had underestimated the enemy. They would not make the same mistake again, or so they thought. The next attempt was larger, a 6,000-man force under the command of Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi. But the core strategic error remained. Kawaguchi, like Ichiki, believed a single, decisive blow could shatter the American defenses. His plan was to march his men on a grueling trek through the dense, trackless jungle south of Henderson Field to attack the American rear, which he believed to be undefended. The jungle, however, proved to be a more formidable enemy than the Marines. The grueling march scattered his units, exhausted his men, and ruined his timetable. His attack, when it finally came on the night of September 12th, was aimed at a low, grassy ridge just south of the airfield. By a stroke of luck or brilliant intuition, this ridge was defended by the elite 1st Marine Raider Battalion, commanded by the legendary Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson. For 2 hellish nights, on what would forever be known as Edson's Ridge, or Bloody Ridge, Kawaguchi's men threw themselves against the thinly held Marine line. The fighting was savage, often hand-to-hand, a desperate struggle in the dark illuminated by flares and explosions. But Edson's raiders, supported by devastatingly accurate artillery fire, refused to break. The Japanese attack crested just short of the airfield and then collapsed. Kawaguchi's shattered brigade dissolved back into the jungle, leaving behind hundreds of their dead on the slopes of the ridge. These land battles were only one facet of the campaign. The true struggle was a relentless, three-dimensional war of attrition. By day, the skies over Henderson Field were a swirling dogfight between the fledgling Cactus Air Force, a motley collection of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots flying from the crude airstrip, and waves of Japanese bombers and Zeros from Rabaul. By night, the sea belonged to the Tokyo Express, the near-nightly runs of Japanese destroyers that raced down the channel between the islands, the slot, to deliver troops and meager supplies and to shell the exhausted Marines. This campaign became a black hole, sucking in resources from across the Pacific. The ripple effect was profound. General Hyakutake, commander of the Japanese 17th Army, was forced to divert troops intended for the campaign in New Guinea, effectively dooming the Japanese attempt to capture Port Moresby via the Kokoda Track. That domino fell. Admiral Yamamoto, seeing the battle for the island escalating, was forced to commit the heavy units of the combined fleet, leading to a series of vicious naval battles, the Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz Islands, that further bled both navies of precious ships and, more importantly, irreplaceable, experienced pilots. Another domino fell. The attrition reached its horrific climax in mid-November, in a series of engagements known as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. It was Japan's all-in gamble. A massive troop convoy was assembled to deliver an entire division, the final blow to crush the American defenders. To pave the way, a powerful naval force, including 2 battleships, was sent to deliver a knockout bombardment to Henderson Field, a repeat of a successful shelling that had nearly destroyed the airfield a month prior. This was the battle that began with the point-blank slugfest that killed Admiral Callahan and sank the USS Juno. The outnumbered American cruiser force, though savaged, accomplished its mission. They turned back the Japanese battleships and saved Henderson Field. The cost was immense, but they had bought time. 2 nights later, the Japanese returned with another battleship, the Kirishima. This time, they were met by a new American task force under the command of Admiral Willis Ching Lee, built around 2 of the Navy's newest battleships, the USS Washington and USS South Dakota. In another chaotic night action, the South Dakota suffered a complete electrical failure and was nearly destroyed. But the USS Washington, guided by its superior SG radar, stalked the Kirishima in the darkness, and in 7 minutes of methodical, radar-directed fire, tore the Japanese battleship apart. It was a stunning vindication of American technology and a symbolic turning of the tables in night combat. The next day, American aircraft found the now unprotected Japanese troop convoy and systematically destroyed it. The final, massive Japanese reinforcement effort had failed. That was the last, decisive domino. The truth was now undeniable. Japan could not supply an army on Guadalcanal, and it could not dislodge the Americans who were there. The island and the momentum of the war now belonged to the United States. The end of the Guadalcanal campaign was not marked by a climactic battle or a formal surrender. It ended with a whisper. In February of 1943, under the cover of darkness, the Imperial Japanese Navy executed its most successful operation of the entire campaign, a masterful evacuation. In a series of daring Tokyo Express runs, destroyers slipped in and evacuated the skeletal survivors of the 17th Army. The Americans, who had just launched their own final offensive and were still bracing for a supposed Japanese counterattack, were caught completely by surprise. When their patrols finally reached the western tip of the island, they found only abandoned equipment, makeshift graves, and the ghosts of an army that had evaporated into the night. But this tactical success masked a strategic catastrophe of the highest order. The autopsy of the campaign revealed the devastating scale of Japan's losses. On the ground, of the more than 31,000 Imperial Army soldiers sent to the island, over 22,000 had perished, the vast majority not from combat but from starvation and disease. 2 entire Japanese divisions had been effectively erased as fighting forces. The losses at sea and in the air were even more crippling. Japan had lost 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and a light carrier. But ships could eventually be replaced. What could not be replaced was the human element. In the skies over the Solomons, the elite, veteran air crews that had begun the war as the world's finest naval aviators were systematically wiped out. The Japanese Naval Air Training Program was small and inflexible. It could not produce replacements of the same caliber. The loss of these men was an unhealable wound, a depletion of skill and experience from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover. The American industrial behemoth, in contrast, was just hitting its stride. For every ship the U.S. Navy lost, a dozen more were sliding down the slipways. For every pilot lost, 100 more were earning their wings in flight schools across America. Guadalcanal laid bare the fundamental, fatal flaw of the Japanese war effort. It was a nation with the heart of a warrior but the logistical capacity of a second-rate power, fighting a nation with the industrial might of a giant. Japan could win battles through skill, bravery, and tactical brilliance as they did at Savo Island. But they could not win a war of attrition. They could not win a war of logistics, win a coup. Guadalcanal was not a battle. It was a 6-month-long math problem, and Japan's answer was always going to be 0. The legacy of this campaign radiated across the globe. It proved to a skeptical Washington that the Pacific War could be won, solidifying support for the island-hopping strategy that would eventually lead to victory. It shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility on land and forged the U.S. Marine Corps into the legendary fighting force of the Pacific War. The lessons learned in the jungles and on the waters of the Solomons, in amphibious warfare, in jungle combat, in logistics, in combined arms operations, became the doctrine for every subsequent battle, from Tarawa to Iwo Jima. The universal lesson of Guadalcanal transcends its time and place. It is a stark reminder that modern warfare is not merely a contest of arms, but a contest of systems. It is won and lost in factories, in supply depots, and on spreadsheets as much as it is on the battlefield. It teaches us that courage and spirit, while essential, cannot overcome a fundamental deficit in material and logistical endurance. A single strategic point, an airfield, a port, a mountain pass, can become a center of gravity for an entire conflict, a vortex that consumes armies and decides the fate of nations. This lesson echoes into our modern era. The principles of air superiority, the critical importance of intelligence and surveillance, and the absolute necessity of a robust supply chain are as fundamental to military operations today as they were to the Cactus Air Force and the beleaguered Marines of 1942. The fight for Guadalcanal was, in many ways, a prototype for the kind of prolonged, resource-intensive conflicts that have defined the decades since. Ultimately, the story of Guadalcanal is a human one. It is the story of men pushed beyond the limits of endurance, fighting not only a determined enemy, but the very environment itself. The malaria, the dysentery, the crushing humidity, the gnawing hunger, and the psychological terror of constant bombardment created a shared hell for both American and Japanese soldiers. The name Guadalcanal is now etched into history, not just as a turning point, but as a byword for suffering and perseverance. The rusted hulks that still lie beneath the calm waters of Iron Bottom Sound are a silent monument. They are a testament to the price of victory, and a solemn warning about the true nature of war, a grinding, unforgiving engine of attrition that rewards not the boldest gambler, but the one with the strength to endure the unendurable. It was on this forgotten island that an empire's ambition died and a new global power was forged in blood, mud, and fire.